Colonel. I'm trying to infiltrate the next episode of the voice actor's copybook, but my audio file size is dummy thick, and the size of my MP3s keeps crashing Sony Vegas. Welcome back to the voice actor's copybook. When you ask someone about voice acting in video games, Metal Gear Solid is always one of those franchises that'll immediately pop into their head. And with good reason. The voice acting is completely iconic, with every single actor across all of the titles bringing their absolute A-game. Anyone who's been born within the past 30 years has probably known at least a handful of people who've spent ages practicing their Solid Snake impressions. But aside from sheer quality alone, there's another reason why Metal Gear Solid is always such a common answer. It's because it was one of the first games to bring good voice acting into the mainstream. We've talked a lot about voice acting on this channel, both good and bad, and you've probably noticed that I've given progressively more favorable reviews to newer examples rather than the older ones. Granted, there's pretty much always been good voice acting to some extent at any given time, but it's not a secret that more and more games have been taking the time and effort to get good performances than they used to. Voiceover is a billion-dollar industry in today's world, and new studios aren't shying away from putting their focus onto the acting and the stories found in their games. And out of all of the years that video games have had voice acting, I think the tipping point was right here, on September 3rd, 1998. This was when Metal Gear Solid first released in Japan, and it showed every other developer in the world just how this thing was meant to be done. Well, more accurately, this guy showed them how it was meant to be done. This man, right here. I love him. Hideo Kojima is what's commonly known as an auteur creator, which means he's completely insane. One of the biggest things that sets him apart from other developers, aside from writing things that only he could make sense of, is the fact that Kojima treats his games more like he's directing a movie. He was making cinematic games way back on the PC-88 with titles like Snatcher and Policenauts, way before the likes of Naughty Dog or Ninja Theory started dipping their toes into the feature film style of games. Granted, they didn't exactly have the sweeping soundscapes or the 4K textures that modern games have. They ran on machines that look like this, with graphics that look like this, and music that sounded like this. But hey, Kojima said himself in the liner notes for the Snatcher radio play that the entire project felt more like making a film or an anime rather than a game. So take it from him. Man loves his movies. This was a development theory that carried all the way through the original Metal Gear to the series' 3D debut in the form of Metal Gear Solid, where Kojima was heavily inspired by films like Escape from New York while crafting his characters for the game. The most famous and most obvious example of this comes in the form of Solid Snake himself, who was essentially Snake Plissken but with a cool bandana instead of an eye patch.
My name is Plissken.
With Kojima so clearly wearing his cinematic influences and ambitions on his sleeve, drawing people into his game would require a little bit of star power, and for that, he was gonna need actors, the best that he could find. Now, one of the best things about describing this entire process is the fact that it's all incredibly well documented, and recently, too. In every other video up to this point, I've had to rely on some amount of speculation. Every single one required me to draw a couple conclusions of my own, and not all of them were completely accurate. As a quick correction, it was pointed out to me by a few commenters in my House of the Dead 2 video that everyone knew the voice acting was bad, not just English speakers as I suggested. Anyway, I digress. The point is that, in a lot of cases, we're obliged to try and fill in some of the gaps between bits and pieces of information, and we're not always going to be correct in our assumptions. But this is like reading a book of facts that's 100 pages long. There are hours upon hours of material that cover every aspect of just the voices featured in these games, with dozens more spent discussing development. The only real problem is that there's so much information that it starts to get more than a little overwhelming. So consider this the Cliff's Notes of Metal Gear Solid voice acting breakdowns. I'm going to take as many details as I can find, narrow them down to the most important bits, and then mash them all into a big video for you to listen to in the background while you eat dinner or something. I don't know. Where am I going with this? Let's start all the way back at the very beginning. In a phenomenal set of interviews with Game Informer, which I highly suggest you watch because we're going to be drawing a lot from these, vocal director Chris Zimmerman Salter revealed that she was put in charge of collecting all of the talent to be featured in Metal Gear Solid 1. She was the vocal director for Hanna-Barbera long before she was approached by Konami, and she immediately and personally scouted out some of her favorite actors and asked them to audition. All but one managed to make the final cut. Some of the actors, such as Cam Clark, had worked alongside Chris Zimmerman Salter in the past, but others hadn't even done voiceover before. While he's credited as having worked on a few TV shows before, Christopher Randolph describes providing the voice of Otacon as his first role. He even mentions that, at one point, he was being considered for the role of Solid Snake. That would have been a pretty different game.
You here to save me, huh? What's your outfit?
It's like one of my Japanese animes.
All in all, every single one of the voice actors have their own stories to tell about the recording process, but all of these little threads all lead to the same point: the house they recorded in. Rather than recording in a proper booth, all of the voice actors were asked to perform in a poorly converted room of a house in the Hollywood Hills, which is described as feeling more like a stage than a recording environment. Anyone who's tried to make their own recording booth definitely knows the struggles of dealing with sound leakage, passing cars, outside construction, those kinds of things. The last thing you want is for those outside sounds to leak into your recordings, and unfortunately, that was unavoidable for the actors of MGS1. It was so bad, in fact, that even after the constant re-recordings of spoiled takes, there was still enough noise left over to make its way into multiple finish lines anyway. Since the sound quality on the PlayStation 1 isn't that great, as all of the sound files were very heavily compressed to make room for the rest of the game, this wasn't a major issue, and it's completely unnoticeable in the final copy of the game. Where a problem did present itself, however, was when Konami and Silicon Knights were putting together the remake, The Twin Snakes, for the GameCube. All of the original recordings suffered from excess noise so badly that they were all deemed unusable, and the developers swiftly commissioned new actors to come in and record them all over again. David Hayter actually had to beg Konami to bring back all of the old voice actors, eventually giving up half of his entire paycheck for the project to help foot the bill.
So on and so forth. So we had to re-record the whole game from scratch, and it was suggested at one point that they just get all new actors except for me, and I said, you know, the people in Metal Gear 1 are some of the best voice actors in the business, and I think you're really lucky to get them, and I think it would be good for the integrity of the game.
But from all of this chaos actually came something positive. All of the actors were present when they were recording scenes that they shared together. If, say, Colonel Campbell was talking to Snake, then both Paul Eiding and David Hayter would go up on the stage and record their lines at the same time. While this sounds pretty minor and like something that might cause even more problems in terms of sound leakage, this had a serious impact on the final performances. As any of my fellow theater kids will know, monologues are hard. It's always difficult to perform alone because you don't have anything or anyone to bounce ideas off of except for yourself. Having someone else physically present gives you a target to act towards, and it's way easier to tailor your performance with the actual person right in front of you rather than what you imagine them reacting like in your head. Would the cast still have been able to give incredible performances even if they hadn't gotten the chance to record face-to-face? Absolutely. Cam Clark was killing it as Kaneda a decade before he was the voice of Liquid. Actors like Debi Mae West, Greg Eagles, and Jennifer Hale would prove time and time again in all of their future projects that they knew exactly what they were doing. None of the people involved with the production of MGS1 could be called a bad actor by even the most negative metrics, and I'm sure that they would have done some great work no matter the circumstances. But being able to record in that theater environment was definitely a big factor in enabling them to push it over the top into something really spectacular.
You've got to have people who are bright, you got to have people who know how to improv, because there are those times when they allow you to do that. They allow you to bring your own stuff inside of a scene when they allow you to have a little freedom, and they did, that makes it live.
So, okay, we understand why the performances were good, but there's an entire title that we still haven't addressed yet. Good voice acting goes mainstream. Well, we have to keep in mind that this was one of the first games that felt like a serious blockbuster. In addition to the voice acting chops on display, the game boasted a pretty lofty script. The final thing clocks in at around 370,000 words, and it dealt with relevant political affairs, military terminology, and genetics. Granted, not all of it was entirely accurate, nor all that deep.
To create a phenotype in which all of the dominant genes were expressed. To create you. I got all of the recessive genes.
That's not how genetics work. But there really wasn't much else on the market at the time that dealt with those matters. Or at the very least, not to the sheer indulgent extent that Metal Gear Solid did. Chris Zimmerman Salter describes the script she received as being about 12 inches thick, and with the amount of codec conversations the game has alone, I don't think that's an exaggeration. On that note, this article from Eurogamer posits Metal Gear Solid 1 as the first modern video game, and a lot of that value is attributed squarely on the codec. Rich Stanton, the author, makes it a point that the codec is Kojima's line of communication directly between himself and the player, and that the voice actors make the messages come through all that much clearer. And honestly, I don't think there's a better way to describe that. All of the cast members were incredibly clear in professing their love for the script and all of the themes on display, and that added level of connection between the actor and the writing helps to cement a good performance. We've discussed this multiple times before, but it's always worth repeating. Great writing begets great performances. All this is to say that a game of this scale and scope was completely unprecedented, especially for 1998, and it was incredibly influential. You have to keep in mind that there weren't many games coming out around that time that could manage to pull off voice acting of that caliber. For example, The House of the Dead 2 released 2 full months after Metal Gear Solid 1. Even games that were published by the same company, Konami, struggled to live up to the same standards. Games like... Games like...
Like Castlevania.
Yes, like Castlevania, thank you. That one had some rough acting. Except for you, Dracula, you were good. Now, if we want to draw any conclusions about the impact of Metal Gear Solid, we can't just look at what was coming out at the time. Common knowledge dictates that the average AAA game takes about 3 years to develop. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less, but 3 years is generally a safe estimate. If we run the clock ahead 3 years from the release date of Metal Gear Solid all the way up to 2001, we should be able to see its direct influence on the industry at large. So, what do we have? Max Payne, Jak and Daxter, Silent Hill 2, Devil May Cry, Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, Zone of the Enders, Grand Theft Auto 3, and a little game, might have heard of it, kind of a cult classic, motherfucking Halo 1! Are you kidding me? Video game voice acting didn't just get good overnight, it got iconic. Nearly anyone who was actually alive during the PlayStation 2 era could put on a pair of headphones and pick out Max Payne's drunken, grizzled grumblings, or Dante's laid-back cool guy voice saying things like, "Jackpot. Come on, it's fucking Master Chief!" Master Chief, you mind telling me what you're doing in this video? Sir, providing an example. Okay, I'm good now. Ooh, sorry. Point is, voice acting had evolved so much since the years since Metal Gear Solid came out, and it only continued to grow and become more important as time went on. Sure, maybe you could argue that it wasn't the sole reason voice acting started being considered something serious. Times were changing quickly back then. New consoles were coming out fast, and game developers were finally getting the hang of making 3D games. Maybe it was an inevitability that the acting would need to evolve alongside that. But I don't think it's that easy to dismiss Metal Gear Solid entirely either. The game was a watershed moment in video game voice acting history, and countless people cite it as a major influence in their creative careers even to this day. The times may have changed, sure, but it's hard to take away the value of a classic even with all the time in the world. these days we've got motion capture artists, Hollywood celebrities, and multi-million-dollar cast listings all coming together to form incredible performances that'll be remembered for decades to come. But back then, in 1998, all they had was a makeshift stage, a 1,000-page script, and the talent and drive to make something amazing. And that's what they did. Metal Gear Solid, here's to you. Thanks for getting me into voice acting. Hi, thanks for watching. I know it's been a very, very long time since I made one of these, and I'm sorry. There's not really much of an excuse that I can give. I tried to make another video, it didn't work out, so I wound up making this one instead. But it was about the same amount of time it took to make a regular episode. It was just the delay from canceling the last one, and it just kind of piled up on me. On top of that, with this whole plague that's descended upon us, things have been a little hectic, but it's given me a lot of time to stay at home and actually write. It's just transferring all my online school stuff to everything else it's a big headache. But yeah, thanks for sticking around. I hope it was worth the wait, and here is a little teaser of what's coming next. Hopefully I'll see you again soon. Stay safe, wash your hands,